Europeans crossed the ocean dreaming of gold, new lands, and an easy path to Asia. They expected empty wilderness or people who would bow to their rule. Instead, they found something entirely different. Before the battles began, let's look at what North America was like before they arrived. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, North America was home to a remarkable tapestry of civilizations. This wasn't just a vast wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was already somebody's home. In fact, it was home to over 500 distinct native nations, each with their own languages, cultures, and ways of life. Imagine the diversity. The Haudenosaunee or Iroquois built complex democratic confederacies in the Northeast. The Pueblo peoples constructed multi-story apartment complexes in the Southwest. The Calusa of Florida created entire islands out of seashells. Talk about extreme home makeovers. These folks weren't just building houses, they were building entire land masses. Warfare wasn't a European import, though. Native nations had their own conflicts, alliances, and power struggles long before strangers arrived with strange weapons. The difference? Traditional native warfare often focused more on symbolic victories, capturing prisoners, or settling specific grievances, not total conquest. It was more like, you stole our hunting grounds, so we'll take your horses, not, we're taking your entire civilization, thanks very much. When those Europeans did arrive, they came hunting three things: gold, land, and power. The Spanish wanted precious metals to fill royal coffers. The French sought furs and trade routes. The English craved farmland and timber. And all of them wanted to plant their flags and claim territory for distant kings and queens who had never set foot on this continent. Nothing says, "It's mine now," quite like sticking a piece of cloth in the ground and declaring ownership of land people have lived on for thousands of years. Ironically, those first meetings weren't always hostile. Many indigenous nations initially welcomed these strange visitors, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes for potential trade benefits, sometimes for possible military alliances against rival tribes. Native peoples often saved early European settlements from starvation by sharing food and farming techniques. Talk about a neighborly welcome. The Wampanoag, for instance, taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn, beans, and squash together, called the Three Sisters Method, a sophisticated agricultural technique that likely saved the Plymouth colony. Without this knowledge, those famous Thanksgiving feasts might never have happened, but generosity was rarely repaid in kind. As settler populations grew, so did their appetite for land. Treaties were signed, then broken. Trade partnerships turned exploitative, and those muskets that seemed like curious novelties became instruments of conquest. The settlers essentially had the world's worst house guests. First, they eat your food, then they redecorate, and finally, they tell you to move out. Few Europeans understood what they were destroying. By the time Christopher Columbus arrived, experts estimate North America was home to anywhere from 5 to 15 million people. By the 1800s, that population had been devastated by disease, displacement, and direct violence. Yet despite this overwhelming force, native resistance was immediate and fierce. Europeans may have brought guns to the fight, but indigenous warriors brought centuries of martial knowledge, intimate familiarity with the landscape, and innovative tactics that would repeatedly frustrate colonial armies. Those early muskets might have seemed impressive, but they were about to meet their match in the hands of people fighting for their homelands. When European colonists began their expansion across North America, they brought with them what they considered an unbeatable advantage: firearms. These early muskets were supposed to guarantee victory against primitive opponents. The settlers couldn't have been more wrong. What the Europeans failed to understand was that native warriors had already mastered the art of warfare suited to their homelands. They didn't need gunpowder to be deadly effective. In fact, those early muskets were far less impressive than Europeans believed. The standard flintlock musket of the 16th and 17th centuries could take up to a minute to reload, weighed around 10 pounds, and became completely useless in rain or humidity. Not exactly the wonder weapon colonists imagined when fighting in North America's forests and swamps. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancée got me one, and I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly, I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear. This one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera or clicking the first link in the description of this video. The first surprise European settlers encountered was guerrilla warfare. Native warriors rarely lined up in neat rows on an open field as European military doctrine demanded. Why would they? That style of fighting made sense in Europe's crowded landscapes, but was suicidal in North America's vast wilderness. Instead, native fighters struck from the shadows, disappeared back into the forest, and attacked again where least expected. During King Philip's War, Wampanoag and Narragansett warriors destroyed over half of New England's settlements despite being outnumbered. Their secret, refusing to fight the way Europeans wanted them to. Colonial militias would march noisily through the forest, heavy muskets on shoulders, bright uniforms making them visible from hundreds of yards away. They might as well have sent written invitations announcing their arrival. Hit-and-run tactics became the nightmare of colonial armies. A sudden volley of arrows would rain down on a column of soldiers, and by the time they had primed their muskets, their attackers had vanished. One British officer complained in his journal, "The savages never stand to face us directly, which is most uncivilized and cowardly." What he called cowardice was actually a brilliant strategy. Why stand still to be shot when you can strike and disappear? Native warriors mastered the art of the ambush. They studied colonial marching patterns and supply routes, picking perfect spots for surprise attacks. A narrow ravine, a river crossing, or dense woodland became deadly traps. In 1755, a combined force of Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Huron warriors virtually destroyed General Braddock's army near Fort Duquesne by letting the British march into a carefully prepared ambush. Over 800 British soldiers died, while the Native coalition lost fewer than 30 warriors. Perhaps most cleverly, many Native nations realized they didn't need to defeat colonial armies directly. They just needed to cut off their supplies. Early American settlements were fragile, dependent on regular shipments of ammunition, medicine, and food from Europe or coastal cities. Native raiding parties targeted these vulnerable supply lines with devastating effectiveness. A small group of warriors could destroy months of provisions in minutes, leaving frontier forts and settlements to slowly starve. The Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia employed this strategy brilliantly. Rather than attacking Jamestown's walls directly, they ambushed hunting parties, burned crops, and intercepted supply boats. The once proud settlement had been reduced to desperate colonists eating leather from their boots. The infamous starving time wasn't caused by direct warfare, but by the tactical genius of cutting off resources. Europeans also discovered another unpleasant surprise. Native warriors could communicate across vast distances in ways colonists couldn't understand. Signal fires, smoke patterns, and drum beats transmitted messages faster than any European courier. One colonial militia would find itself under attack, and by the time reinforcements arrived from another settlement, the warriors had already moved on to a new target 20 miles away. It was as if the entire forest itself was coordinating against them. Colonists never knew when or where an attack might come. The constant uncertainty created fear that sapped morale and resources. Settlements spent enormous amounts of money building walls and posting guards, often for attacks that never came because the warriors were targeting something else entirely. As colonial push came to inevitable native shove, European settlers gradually realized that their fancy guns weren't the decisive advantage they'd expected. Native Americans didn't need firearms to wage effective resistance. They had something better. While colonists relied on their slow-loading muskets, indigenous warriors wielded an arsenal perfectly suited to the North American battlefield. The bow and arrow stood as the cornerstone of Native American warfare long before European arrival. Far from the crude implements portrayed in Hollywood movies, these weapons were engineering marvels. A skilled Cherokee or Comanche archer could fire up to 20 arrows per minute. a rate of fire that wouldn't be matched by firearms until the invention of repeating rifles 3 centuries later. While a colonial soldier fumbled to reload after a single shot, he might face a dozen arrows before his musket was ready again. Talk about bringing an arrow to a gunfight and winning. Accuracy, too, gave native archers a distinct edge. Early muskets were notoriously inaccurate beyond 50 yards. In contrast, accomplished native bowmen regularly hit targets at 150 yards. Apache warriors reportedly could hit moving targets from horseback at full gallop, a feat that would impress even modern marksmen. The quiet nature of archery added another advantage. A musket announced its location to everyone within earshot, while an arrow revealed nothing about its source. It's like the difference between sending a text message and shouting your message through a megaphone. Tomahawks might be the most misunderstood Native American weapon. These weren't simply axes, but versatile tools of war that served multiple purposes. Crafted from stone, bone, or later traded metal, the traditional tomahawk featured a wooden handle averaging 14 to 20 inches long and a carefully balanced head. This balance allowed warriors to throw tomahawks with deadly accuracy up to 30 feet, often aiming for the head or neck of an opponent. Europeans soon learned that getting the axe had a much more literal meaning when fighting native warriors. Many tribes developed unique tomahawk fighting styles that combined close-quarter strikes, blocks, and throwing techniques into a fluid martial art. The Iroquois Confederacy became particularly known for warriors who could seamlessly transition between throwing and hand-to-hand combat. Unlike European weapons designed for specialized purposes, the tomahawk served as tool, weapon, and ceremonial item, representing resourcefulness that continuously confused colonial forces. It was the Swiss Army knife of its day, except considerably more lethal. War clubs revealed tremendous cultural and regional variation across the continent. The ball-headed clubs of northeast woodland tribes could crush a skull with a single strike. The curved rabbit stick of southwest tribes doubled as a hunting tool and weapon. Some of the most feared were the gunstock clubs used by plains tribes, shaped like European rifle stocks but crafted entirely of hardwood with sharp bone or stone blades embedded along the striking edge. Early settlers who mocked these wooden guns quickly learned they were just as deadly as the metal ones, and never needed reloading. These clubs weren't crude bludgeons, but carefully engineered weapons. The Penobscot tribes of Maine crafted war clubs with specially designed weak points in the handle that absorbed shock while delivering maximum force to the target. Essentially, prehistoric shock absorption technology. Some war clubs recovered from archaeological sites show evidence of having been passed down through multiple generations, with elaborate carvings documenting battles and kills. It was the original family heirloom that could also bash in an enemy's head. Spears and lances offered rich advantages in combat. Plains tribes like the Lakota developed 14-foot lances for mounted warfare that allowed warriors to strike opponents without coming within sword range. Fishing spears used by coastal tribes featured multiple prongs with detachable barbed points connected to the main shaft by cordage. When embedded in an enemy, these barbs were nearly impossible to remove without causing catastrophic damage. The colonists' idea of point and shoot took on a whole new meaning when facing these weapons. The knife, whether crafted from stone, bone, shell, or traded metal, often determined the outcome of close combat. Native fighting techniques emphasized swift, fluid movements rather than the rigid fencing styles of Europeans. Many tribes developed specialized fighting knives with distinctive shapes based on centuries of battlefield experience. The Ute Heart Ripper knife featured a hooked blade designed to slip between ribs, while certain southeast tribes crafted knives with serrated obsidian edges sharper than surgical steel. When your knife can cut through armor easier than a modern scalpel cuts paper, who needs bullets? Traps and snares demonstrated environmental mastery that turned the landscape itself into a weapon. Pit traps lined with sharpened stakes claimed countless colonial lives, especially during night marches. Some tribes engineered falling log traps triggered by tripwires across known paths. The Delaware and Shawnee became infamous for constructing elaborate mazes of deadfalls and snares around their territories that decimated pursuing forces. It was like Home Alone, but instead of paint cans and toy cars, it was lethal wooden spikes and crushing boulders. Warriors would intentionally leave an obvious trail leading pursuers into carefully prepared killing zones where dozens of hidden archers waited. Colonial militia frequently found themselves channeled into ravines or clearings where they faced overwhelming fire from concealed positions on all sides. Settlers who boasted about tracking Indians often discovered they were the ones being led around like tourists on a deadly sightseeing tour. These traditional weapons, perfectly adapted to their environment and wielded by highly trained warriors, presented a formidable challenge to European invasion. But the weapons themselves were only part of the equation. Native Americans didn't need fancy military manuals to understand something European settlers learned the hard way. The land itself could be the deadliest weapon of all. While European armies were trained to march in neat lines across open fields, Native warriors turned America's diverse landscapes into their greatest allies. The trees have eyes wasn't just a scary story settlers told their children, it was their everyday reality. European military tactics relied heavily on visibility and organized formations. These advantages disappeared the moment they stepped into North America's dense forests. Native warriors moved through woodland like ghosts, trained from childhood to walk silently across fallen leaves. Colonial records from the 1600s describe terrified soldiers firing wildly into the woods, wasting precious ammunition on shadows while actual warriors struck from completely different directions. The wide-open grasslands of the Great Plains presented different challenges, but tribes there developed equally effective fighting styles. Though horses weren't native to North America, tribes like the Comanche and Lakota transformed them into living weapons platforms. Plains warriors didn't just ride horses, they became one with them. Young boys practiced riding bareback at full gallop by age 6, eventually developing the ability to hang off the side of a running horse, using its body as a shield while firing arrows from underneath its neck. Speed became their greatest advantage. While settler wagons crawled across the plains at 2 to 3 miles per hour, mounted war parties could cover 40 to 50 miles daily. Mountain warfare made masterful use of terrain. Cherokee fighters in the Appalachians would lure pursuing soldiers along narrow ridgelines, then attack from both above and below, a tactic later military schools would study as vertical ambush. Rivers weren't barriers, but highways for many tribal nations. The Penobscot of Maine built lightweight birch bark canoes that could carry warriors silently past settler outposts at night. These boats could be carried overland to bypass enemy positions, something the heavy European boats couldn't manage without causing enough noise to wake the dead. In the Southwest, Pueblo defenders built their settlements into cliffside alcoves that were nearly impossible to attack. Spanish conquistadors found themselves stuck at the bottom of sheer rock faces, pelted with stones and arrows while completely exposed. The Mesa Verde dwellings weren't just architectural marvels, they were practically impregnable fortresses that made attacking about as effective as trying to punch clouds. Winter, which European armies traditionally used for rest, became the prime fighting season for many northern tribes. Native warriors developed specialized equipment for winter combat, including snowshoes that distributed weight across deep snow. While heavily laden European soldiers might sink waist-deep in drifts, native fighters glided across the surface, maintaining full mobility. During one brutal winter campaign in 1690, a group of Abenaki warriors traveled 200 miles on snowshoes to attack English settlements, a journey the English considered physically impossible in those conditions. The cold itself became a weapon. Warriors would sometimes wet their arrows before firing them in freezing temperatures, causing the arrowheads to freeze into wounds. As brutal as these tactics were, they reflected the desperate nature of what had become a fight for survival. Just as Native Americans had adapted their battle techniques to the diverse landscapes of North America, they would soon develop other warfare tactics. In the battle for North America, Native Americans understood something many modern military strategists still struggle with. The most powerful weapon isn't the one that kills the body, but the one that conquers the mind. Long before European settlers arrived with their muskets and cannons, tribes had perfected psychological warfare tactics that would make today's special forces take notes. War cries remain one of the most recognized yet misunderstood elements of Native American warfare. Far from random screaming, these battle sounds were carefully designed sound weapons. The high-pitched, undulating yells created a disorienting acoustic effect that made it nearly impossible for enemies to communicate or coordinate. European military units relied heavily on verbal commands during battle. When Haudenosaunee warriors unleashed their war cries, settler militias often couldn't hear their officers' orders over the din. According to journals from the 1700s, some British soldiers stuffed cloth in their ears before battles against certain tribes, only to find this made them more vulnerable to surprise attacks they couldn't hear coming. Drums played an equally strategic role. Many tribes positioned drummers at specific distances to create echoes that made their forces sound much larger. During night raids, drummers would start rhythms from multiple directions, convincing settlers they were surrounded by hundreds when perhaps only dozens were present. In some documented cases from the French and Indian War, entire settler outposts were abandoned after nights of psychological drumming, without a single arrow being fired. The strategic use of appearance transformed native warriors into psychological weapons. War paint wasn't just decoration, it was psychological armor. Red symbolized war and blood to many tribes, while black often represented death or the spirit world. Warriors painted in these colors seemed otherworldly to European settlers, many of whom were already superstitious. Some tribes applied paint in patterns resembling skulls or animal features, triggering primal fears in their opponents. These visual tactics worked so effectively that colonial authorities issued orders forbidding soldiers from discussing painted savages around new recruits, fearing it would damage morale before they even reached the frontier. The timing of attacks multiplied their psychological impact. Native warriors preferred dawn and dusk, times when human vision struggles with shadows and depth perception. A research study of colonial-era attacks found that nearly 60% occurred during these transitional light periods. Settlers called dusk the Indian hour and often retreated to fortified positions before the sun began setting. Even more terrifying were the full moon attacks, when warriors would strike on the brightest nights of the month, sending the message that they could attack whenever they chose, light or dark. Sleep deprivation became a refined tactic that drained settler resources without risking warrior lives. Small groups would take turns making noise around settlements all night, breaking branches, mimicking animal calls, or occasionally firing arrows onto rooftops. After several sleepless nights, exhausted settlers made mistakes, argued among themselves, and became easy targets. One frontier doctor in 1772 documented what he called frontier madness, a condition where sleep-deprived settlers became paranoid and unable to function after weeks of nighttime harassment. Information warfare played a crucial role as well. Tribes would deliberately leave behind evidence of their presence, footprints pointing in multiple directions, abandoned campsites suggesting massive numbers, or strategic items that sent specific messages. A single eagle feather left at a water source might indicate to settlers that their movements were being watched. These psychological breadcrumbs created a constant sense of surveillance and vulnerability that wore down settler resolve more effectively than direct confrontation. Perhaps most disturbing to European sensibilities was the strategic use of selective violence. Rather than wiping out entire settlements, some war parties would deliberately leave survivors, specifically those who would spread the most dramatic accounts of what they'd witnessed. This carefully calibrated approach to terror multiplied the psychological impact far beyond the actual casualties. Stories spread through colonial territories faster than any physical threat could travel, causing settlements hundreds of miles away to panic and divert resources to defense. History often paints victory as a matter of superior weapons, but Native Americans proved that strategy, adaptability, and knowledge of the land could rival even gunpowder. Their fight wasn't just about war, it was about survival. In the end, their greatest weapon wasn't a bow or tomahawk, but resilience itself.